Thank you very much. As Sarah mentioned, what I will be speaking about today is related to my book that was recently published, but I want to give you a bit of the background and some of the information that my comfort zone where we are right now, not only because of the pizza, but because of the kind of academic environment that we're in. So this is the kind of place where I feel like I can really open up the background, the details behind the book, and share it with you because I think we are each other's people. I will be talking about whaling. This is hunting whales for food. Sometimes when I mention that I study whales, I am viewed as more of a marine biologist or maybe something related to whale watching. If you've been out on the Cape and taken one of those tours, you've certainly seen some whales. That's not the interaction with whales that we'll be talking about today. This is much more visceral, much more unmediated. This is a situation in which people in two very different places, which I'll introduce to you in just a moment, hunt whales to produce food to eat. With that, I'll give you the caveat that I've got some photography here that's going to be very dramatic and maybe even a bit shocking to some of you. We're going to see pictures of whales being hunted and killed. So I want to prepare you for that. If you do need to look away, think of something more pleasant, I will not take offense to that. But just understand that for those of you eating pizza with meat on top of it, the cheese was made. No, but we all live in a society that, whether we personally partake or not, the society does condone the use of animals for food, right? That's what we do here in this country. And so what you're seeing, while it looks different, while the species are different, the people may appear different than what you're familiar with. There is that point of connection, right? This isn't quite as foreign as it may look at first glance. The image on the screen here is what it looks like to board a whaling boat. This one is offshore from the island of St. Vincent in the Caribbean. And that's the first place that I'm going to talk about. So St. Vincent is located in the southern Caribbean. The map on the left shows you where it is. If you don't know St. Vincent, think of maybe St. Lucia or Barbados or Grenada. They're all in the same neighborhood down there, just north of South America. The animals on the right are a sampling of the species that are hunted by Vincentian whalers. This isn't all of them. I didn't have enough room for all of them. They hunt a wide variety of species. And you're probably looking at that column of animals thinking, well, only a couple of those are whales, right? Those look like dolphins to me. In fact, the bottom two even have the word dolphin in their name. I want you to, if you can, try to dissolve the line between whales and dolphins, and instead think of a category called cetaceans. Cetaceans are marine mammals, separate from the seals, the walruses, the manatees, and it spans the species that include whales and dolphins. On St. Vincent where whaling takes place from. So all the whalers live there. The whaling boats set out from there in the morning. I've met a few people who wanted to become whalers and moved to Barely in order to do it. A few times in the past 100 years or so, someone has tried to start up a whaling boat company in a different village, and it's either failed and gone out of business, or they've moved to Barely. So there's just something about this town here that attracts the whalers. Looking at the town, it doesn't look all that unique. It looks like most other Vincentian towns. It's hilly. It's on the has some docks, has some boats tied out front. Not very much special to it from this vantage. You have to get into the town. You have to talk to the people, look at more of a micro scale to see what is different about this town. And let me add at this point, I'm perfectly happy for anybody to ask a question during the talk, please don't feel like you need to wait till the end. At the end, there will be time for questions, and at that point, we'll be passing around a handheld microphone. If you have a question during the talk, that's perfectly fine. Just raise your hand. I'll probably repeat your question back to you, just so that our good friends online can hear what you asked. Yes, please. Good question. She asked if the whole island eats whales or not. We are, one of the current phases of my research is doing dietary surveys. I was just in St. Vincent a couple of months ago with some students. We surveyed over 900 people asking about their normal diet. What do you eat every day? And we're currently compiling that data, so I don't have, a really specific answer for you, but we've certainly got a lot of yeses from all over the island. Great question. I think there's a bit of a geographic vibe going on here. I'm a geographer by training, and I love these kind of spatial and network type questions. The answer is both. So most of the whale is sold locally there in that village, so people know to go there to buy it. However, you know how if you're at home, you hear the little ding, ding, ding. It's the ice cream man coming down your street. They have that, but instead of a ding, 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 it's a conch shell blowing, and instead of an ice cream man, it's a whale woman. She drives through the villages selling whale from her vehicle. So not much different from what we grew up with, except for the fact that it's the conch shell on the whale. This is what a whaling boat looks like. You saw the images on the previous screen, but I want to focus in on the people and the equipment here. The first thing that you probably notice about this boat is that it's awfully small for going out into the ocean to catch whales. This is the size boat that they use. If they catch some of those smaller dolphins, they haul them on board and carry them in the hull. If they catch larger animals like pilot whales or killer whales, they tie them alongside and drag them through the water as they are continuing to hunt. There's a stand on the front that holds a harpoon gun. The harpoons are made locally from locally available products. The gun is a modified shotgun. It's been modified to have a wider barrel so it can hold a harpoon instead of just the shot from a shotgun. 3 people crew the boat. The person in the front is the harpooner. He's also the captain. The person in the back is called the stern man. He sits in the stern and drives. And the person in the middle is called the center man, and he does whatever he can to help the other 2. He is the lowest ranking member of the crew. He's the least skilled member of the crew. And when I went aboard the whaleboat, I was the center man. That's where they put me. Let's look at what whaling is like. You motor around looking for signs that there might be whales in the area. What kind of signs might you look for? Whales live underwater. You can't just see them. But what would you look for? Great. So she mentioned when they breathe, right? There's a spray that comes out of their blowhole when they breathe. You can see that spray. And in fact, if you're good, if you know what you're looking for, the shape and direction of the spray can tell you what species of whale it is. There are regulations, there are international regulations that say certain species of whales are not allowed to be hunted. And the Vincentians adhere to those policies. So if they see a spray, they would hate to waste all their time and gas in motoring out to where that spray was if it's a species they're not allowed to hunt. So they learn to identify the species of whale in part by the shape of the spray that comes out of its blowhole. That's good. Anybody have another idea of what you might look for? You're out there on the ocean, nothing but water on the horizon. What do you look for to see? You would make an excellent whaler. She said she was scanning the sky looking for birds, diving for fish, which were probably also being chased by whales from below. It's hard to be a fish, right? You get it from both above and below. The birds are diving in to eat you, the whales are swimming up to eat you, and the birds then can be clues that there might be whales in the area. You also look for flotsam, for things that are just floating on the surface. Rafts of sargassum, seaweed that has accumulated, trash, marine debris, what are called ghost nets, nets that have been cut loose or fallen loose from their boats and are just drifting, sometimes with buoys on the surface. All of these things will attract fish, which then attract whales. These are all toothed whales. They're not the kind that filter krill out of the water. They go after medium to large fish. So if you find fish, you have a chance of finding whales as well. The whale, or the dolphin in this case, that's surfacing in this image is a Risso's dolphin. It was one of the ones in the column that I showed you a moment ago. And this was actually the first whale or dolphin that I ever saw get killed in the Caribbean. So I took this photo. I'm on board this boat, watching as we're pursuing this animal, and I see it, rising every few seconds to breathe, and we're tracking it. When the boat and the harpoon gun and the dolphin were lined up, the harpooner squeezed the trigger and let the harpoon fly. I had never seen him fire a harpoon yet. This was my first day of going out whaling. So I didn't quite know what to expect. The harpoon landed in the dolphin. It did not kill the dolphin, it just attached it to the boat. So now the dolphin is frantically trying to get away, right? It's paddling its fluke, trying to swim away. We, the three of us, the stern man, the harpooner, and me, began to haul it into the boat. We hauled it into the side. We got a good view of it there. You can see those white marks that indicate that it's a Risso's dolphin. We pulled it into the side and then hauled it up on board the boat. And in case you're wondering, or if the screen might be a little too dark for you, that facial expression means put your camera down and help us haul, you lazy American. Yes, sir. Yes, they do. So that's a good question. He asked if the different species react to being hunted differently. I was kind of joking, ma'am, when I told you that you would make a good whaler. I'm not joking when I say these whalers would make good marine biologists. They know the behavior, they know the feeding patterns, the diving patterns of these animals, as well as most PhD marine biologists would, because of course they spend every day with them. Certain species, when they dive, they come back up pretty soon. So you know just to hang out in the area and you'll see it again soon. We once saw a beaked whale on the surface and it dove, and the guys in the boat said, well, we might as well just leave because those stay underwater for at least a half an hour. And they're right. The beaked whales are some of the deepest diving animals in the ocean, deepest diving air-breathing animals in the ocean, and it wasn't going to come up anytime soon. We would be wasting our time just to wait for it to resurface. My research at first, and Sarah alluded to the fact I've been at this for almost 15 years. I think I first set foot in St. Vincent in 2008. So it's been a little over 10 years for this site. The next site that I talk about, which is in Northern Europe, goes back a bit further. So that's getting a little closer to 15. But my research has evolved since I've been working there. The first questions that I was asking had to do with conservation, right? I'm an ocean lover. I'm a whale and dolphin lover, if such a thing can be. I grew up in Florida, where we were at the beach all the time, and we would see dolphins sometimes swimming close to shore, and it was a special moment. If you've been out to the beach and seen that, you know that feeling. Or even better, if you've been out on a whale watching trip, you know how special it is to see these animals. I was concerned for these animals. I heard that there was hunting going on, and I wanted to find out, is it sustainable, right? Are they over-hunting these animals? They're going to take them all out of the ocean. Is it cruel? Are they causing harm to these individual animals in a way that needs to be addressed, right? I believe that animals have feelings like pain and fear, like we do, and I was concerned for the animals. So I applied several different methods to my research. I carried a GPS when we were out whaling, and I got to measure where they went, and I got to mark where we would, if you see in the key here, it says sightings. That indicates that we didn't always catch a whale when we tried to, but still, it's important to know where they are. I was marking where they had been seen. I looked through the records, and I know this looks like chicken scratch to you, and to my work-study student who has to transcribe all this stuff, it definitely is. But I looked through the records going back as far as they existed, which for me was 2007. But then I found where other researchers had compiled records going back much further than that, back to about the middle of the 20th century. I wanted to know how many whales and dolphins had been killed over the years. I'll let you know, these gaps are not periods of time when there was no whaling. These are periods of time when there was no data. So because the whalers themselves and then the government of the country don't really keep that accurate of record, or don't keep records at all, beyond just a few years, this data set relies on researchers being in the field. The gap right here 2013 and 14, that was my fault. I didn't go to the Caribbean during those 2 years. I was in the process of moving from one university to another and kind of starting up a new lab in a new place and wasn't able to go. And when I finally did get down there, I think in 2016, they had already thrown out the records from those 2 years. But think about that. This is the data set. This is it, right? There's no way that's going to come back. So in 100 years, if someone is studying whaling, if it still even is happening then, there's going to be that gap from when I, just this one guy, was moving from one university to the other. That's how small scale this is, right? It's not some large operation that has a lot of oversight. It's small, it's local, it's locally run, and it's very unregulated and unreported. When the whales are brought ashore, I'm sorry for this image, they are processed for food first by removing the internal organs. Usually that happens on the dock. And children are able to come and watch or even help out like these kids are. Most of these kids are ranging from about 8 to 15 years old. Think of what you were doing when you were 8 to 15 years old. It was most likely not something like this. The carcasses then are brought to the beach where a temporary processing facility is set up with just these little tables here. You can see the carcasses back in the back there. The first table is the meat table. They chop the mussels into smaller pieces that they will then further process, and I'll show you that in just a moment. The next table is the blubber table. Blubber is the layer of fat on the outside of a whale. It keeps it warm in the cold ocean. They chop that up separate from the meat and process it differently. The meat is processed by hanging in the sun to dry. So if you've ever eaten like beef jerky, or even if you're a vegetarian and have had like dried fruit, that's kind of the consistency that you're going for here. They usually rehydrate it before eating it. This is more for preservation than for consumption. The blubber, are these white chunks here. They're cooked over a fire. The oil is removed from the blubber. It's used as a medicine. There's a local belief, I don't know that it's ever been tested by medical researchers, but there's a belief that the oil will cure things like the common cold. The blubber then is just consumed maybe like a person in this country might eat bacon or pork rinds, you know, crispy fat. Here's what the food products look like. And here's how often they are consumed. After I began to answer some questions about conservation, or began to run into dead ends in my attempts to answer some of those questions, I started finding that there were more questions arising in this research. I don't know, does the environmental studies program here at Tufts have kind of a student research component? Do you get the opportunities as students to help your professors with their research? I'm seeing some nods. I hope that you do. I think that's a very valuable part of an education. One thing about a research project that will let you know that it's a really good project, especially that it's a good fit for you, is if it produces more questions than answers. And that's exactly what this did. This is how I knew that I had found a good fit for myself. Every time I would answer a question, like the sustainability, for example, well, the records showed that this whaling had been going on for more than 50 years with roughly the same amount of effort, right? Same number of boats, same number of whalers, and that the catch had not been decreasing. If it had been decreasing, that might be an indication that they were taking too many whales or dolphins. Now that's kind of a specious claim, right? Because we don't have records on how many whales and dolphins there are in the ocean, or at least not in this portion of the ocean, right? We just haven't counted them in the Caribbean yet. So we're making some guesses here. But I started to become satisfied, at least partially satisfied, with the sustainability questions. I got a lot more interested, though, in the human questions. I was curious about what this food product means to this culture, what it means to their health, what it means to their food security. And I started following some of those questions after leaving the conservation questions not quite fully addressed, but at least on the table for a while. And this is one of the first forays into that human side of the research. I asked people how much they ate. This is not the large survey that I mentioned just a moment ago that happened this past summer. This was just a smaller survey that I did on my own. And I got basically the information that people use or consume these products about once every 2 weeks, with the exception of women using the oil. Oil is not only seen as a medicine, that's how most people use it, but both genders use it. It's also seen as kind of a beauty product, which is more associated with women. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if you'll address this later, but I was curious about the price of it. Is it something that most people have?
Yeah, thanks for asking about the price. Until recently, it was the cheapest meat on the island. So if you eat meat and you're poor, it's the way to make your money go the furthest. In recent years, and by that I mean like the past 5 years or so, there's been a lot of very cheap imported meat coming from the US. So that status as the cheapest meat might be shifting right now. But for a long time, it was the cheapest one. Now, of course, you could be a vegetarian and spend even less. And there is quite a vegetarian segment of the community. This is a Rastafarian island, or many Rastafarians live on this island, which are mostly vegetarian. But of the people who eat meat, whale meat is the way to go in order to get a good deal. When I got these data back on consumption, oh yes, ma'am, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I just had a question.
Yes.
Why did you split like the product?
Because of that oil difference. Because I noticed in my surveys, and I had this written. I'm sorry. Her question was, why did I split it into gender? I noticed that almost all of my responses related to the use of oil were coming from my female respondents. And I had a follow-up question in the survey, which I don't have in this graph, that was, if it's oil, what do you use it for? And the men all wrote for curing the cold. And the women wrote for curing the cold, and I put it on my skin and I put it on my hair. So I wanted to show that difference here. Also, that relates to what I'm going to talk about next, which is another place where whaling happens, which I've previously done research in before I started in St. Vincent, but then I started to revisit after getting this consumption data. When I realized it was such a staple of the diet, right? Once every 2 weeks. Is there any food that you eat once every 2 weeks? It's hard for me to think, right, a certain meal. Pizza, no. I mean, maybe I wish I did, but right, there's nothing that I eat that frequently. I have a much more varied diet than that. This was an important part of their diet, and I was interested to know the effects of that. And that took me back to a place called the Faroe Islands. This is in the far North Atlantic. It doesn't even really show up on that map, which is why I just have a circle around the ocean. Think of about halfway between Scotland and Iceland. That's about where these islands are located. If you know anything at all about the Faroe Islands, you've seen news stories like this, right? This was from CNN just a few months ago, August, and it's these dramatic scenes of whales being killed on a beach, the water turning into blood. Looks just horrifying, right? This is what most people know about the Faroe Islands. This and the fact that they recently got a Michelin-starred restaurant that people are going to visit now, and they do actually serve whale at that restaurant. In the Faroes, they hunt whale as well. They do it in a very different method. They drive the whales ashore en masse. That is, they get in boats and chase the whales into a bay, induce them to beach themselves. You hear about whales maybe out on the Cape coming ashore and beaching just naturally. In the Faroe Islands, they cause this to happen. Right? They drive them in, cause them to beach, drive hooks into their blowholes, haul them ashore, and cut their spinal cords with handheld knives. This is what turns the water red. This is why when the whaling is finished, the ocean has turned red. I'm sorry. It's a hard thing to watch. I read a book about the first time that not the first time I saw it, but a time when I took students along, undergraduate students along. And we didn't know it was going to happen. They never announce it. It's just when they find the whales. And we happened to be there for it. And the reactions among my students were very similar to the reactions that I'm seeing with your expressions right now. A mixture of shock, disgust, curiosity on some faces, but certainly nobody just took it into stride like it was a normal part of the day. In the Faroe Islands then, the meat and blubber are taken off the animals, off the carcasses, just like they are in St. Vincent. They are hung up to dry in these little houses. But other than the fact that it's inside of a structure, it's essentially the same product. The meat is hung up and, again, takes on that beef jerky-like consistency. The blubber is dried as well. It's not cooked in this case. and they're served together. This is the blubber, the meat, with potatoes and codfish. And this is considered to be the national meal of the Faroe Islands. I don't know if I'm selling Faroe Islands tourism very well right now or not, but that's what they like to eat. The reason that I began thinking back to the Faroe Islands when I realized how popular whale meat and blubber were in St. Vincent is because since the 1970s, there's been research done in the Faroe Islands on the presence of environmental contaminants in these foods. If you know anything about ocean ecology, you know that toothed whales are very high on the trophic levels, right? They're high on the food chain. And you know about bioaccumulation, right? You know that contaminants increase as you move up the food chain. Biomagnification. They increase as they move up the food chain. In 1978, the first scientific paper on this problem in the Faroe Islands was published, and these were the numbers. So total mercury is all the mercury in there. Methyl-mercury is a portion of that total mercury which has been methylated, and methyl-mercury is the more dangerous kind for people. These numbers probably don't mean much to you without a context, so I'll give you a little context now and then some more later. The World Health Organization says that if the total mercury is above 1, don't eat it. So this is above 1. I mean, it's 50% higher than 1, right? So it's something that you should avoid eating because it exceeds that World Health Organization's number. Yes, sir?
I just wondered, how were those samples taken? Do you know how they?
Yeah, so in the Faroe Islands, the National Museum, of all places, has a staff of biologists that attend as many of these whale drives as they can. What normally happens is someone sees the whales, they have a protocol that they're supposed to follow to alert people, and these biologists are part of that phone chain, basically. They have a vehicle that's this bright red van with these whales painted on the side. They call it the whale-mobile, and they hop in and drive it to the site where the whales are being driven. When they get there, they're not helping with the killing. They're instead taking biopsy samples from the muscle and blubber to take back to the lab then and analyze for. Yeah, so because they eat both, the biologists test both. Now, if you know anything about the accumulation of different contaminants, you know that fatty tissue like blubber doesn't usually absorb much mercury, but there are other contaminants associated with mercury, like PCBs, that they're looking for there. So these were the numbers that they found in their first study, right? And this was shocking enough to Faroese public health authorities that they kind of went on a blitz of expressing this information, sharing this information, both at home and abroad. So you notice the title of this talk here is in English. This was in, well, it was in the Faroe Islands, but it was obviously for a foreign audience, an international audience. The health researchers would share this information domestically in Faroese as well. There were radio programs, there were televised interviews. They're trying to get the word out, right? There were newspaper articles saying, look, this stuff has got 50% more mercury than the World Health Organization says we should eat. We got to stop. Right? This was the message that went out. They didn't quite tell people to stop eating it like maybe the US government tells people to stop smoking. What they did, though, is tell people, cut back. And here's the amount by which you should cut back, right? Here's the maximum you should consume. But as they continued doing this research, remember, this was 1978, they were finding more and more mercury. So the mercury levels were increasing as they were continuing to study. And the recommendations then were getting more and more strict. So they went from saying, eat it at most once every 2 weeks to eat it at most once every month, right? And then maybe every couple of months. It was getting further and further apart, these recommended times that you could have the food. And then in 2012, in 2008, this is a publication about something that happened 4 years later. In 2008, those same health authorities published this recommendation, which I'll let you read, that basically says there's no safe amount that you can eat. And this does parallel the US approach to something like cigarette smoking, right? The government doesn't say, cut back on smoking. They say, you need to stop. It's unhealthy. That's what the health authorities said in the Faroe Islands about whale. And this was important, right? This was a big deal. Now, of course, you wouldn't expect people to adhere to this immediately, just like people have not quit smoking. But this did have a major impact on the diet, right? People stopped eating or reduced eating in response to this. Yes, sir.
Would you say that was for health reasons, or was there like an aspect?
No, that's a good question. He asked about the the reason for stopping to eat, whether it was health or ethics, or a mix of the two, I guess, it was almost exclusively health. There have been small kind of animal rights activist voices within the Faroe Islands that have said we should stop doing this for more ethical reasons. However, since the time that there's been protests coming in from outside, Sea Shepherd and Greenpeace coming in, those voices within the Faroe Islands have really quieted down. And I think this is for solidarity, right? They don't want to be siding with the foreigners who are coming in saying to stop whaling. They want to be expressing the local opinion, which is we are Faroese and we do this. In fact, the response to this suggestion was actually to reduce consumption. 2 years later, Sea Shepherd came in with a major televised campaign against Faroese whaling, and consumption levels went back up in response to that, as kind of a show of solidarity against Sea Shepherd. I wondered what the numbers were like in the Caribbean. So together with my students at Sewanee, at University of the South, where I teach, and then with some colleagues at other universities, I began testing tissue of the animals brought ashore in St. Vincent. In addition to measuring the amount of mercury, I decided to go much more in depth with the dietary surveys. And I sent students to basically every village in the country to ask groups of local people like this about their diet. One of the questions that we asked was this one: is it healthy? Now, not, do you believe it to be healthy? Because when you ask someone, do you believe, that kind of colors your question, right? It means that maybe you as the questioner don't believe. But when you just ask somebody, is it healthy? And they respond, as 2/3 of the people did, yes, it is, that tells you what people believe, right? They don't have the information about mercury yet because we're testing it. They believe it to be healthy. That's the baseline that we're working with. Yes? So this is in the Caribbean. Yeah, it's okay. This is in the Caribbean, and the concept of a healthy food does go back quite far there. There's a big focus within the culture on eating local, on eating fresh. I mean, kind of the stuff that is more recent in this country has been done for a long time down there, right? So I would argue that, yes, eating healthy has been important there for a long time. But look at this result, right? So 2/3 of the people believe it to be healthy, and yet we're finding mercury in the tissue that might indicate that it's not. And I'll show you some of the numbers in just a moment. But this response really got me worried. And I started digging through the literature about, could it be healthy? And I found this suggestion from a study in the Arctic. I'll give you a moment to read that. This middle line is the most important one here. The recommendation, all things considered, is that the consumption of these traditional foods continue. Yes, they have pollutants in them, but they also have benefits. And I wondered if maybe the people that I was working with, maybe if they got this, right? If they understood there might be some risk, but they also understood the benefits that came along with it. And at this point, I hadn't quite finished the mercury study. I was still collecting data. But how bad could it be? If it was 50% higher than the World Health Organization's recommendation, like in the Faroe Islands, maybe there's some balance there. Maybe there's some good and some bad. But then I got my numbers back. So in the Faroe Islands in 1978, 1.5 parts per million was enough for the government to start a major study that's still going on today, more than 40 years later, aimed at ceasing the consumption of this food, 1.5 parts per million. My average is 77. I can't think of any benefit from this food that would outweigh that. So now my mission has shifted. For the past 10 years, I've been working with the Ministry of Fisheries on questions of conservation, questions of providing for food security. I've started working with the Ministry of Health now. And my goal is no longer to find that balance. My goal is to do, regrettably, what had to be done in the Faroe Islands, which was spread the word that this is not a safe food. But I don't stop there. I want to know why. I want to know, where is this stuff coming from? There is no industry in St. Vincent and the Grenadines that produces mercury as a byproduct. There are industries here and in lots of other countries that do, most notably coal-fired power plants. Where's it coming from? How's it getting there? Is it coming in on the ocean currents? Is it drifting in through the atmosphere and then raining down? Is it raining someplace else and then coming into the ocean through rivers? These are geographical questions. These are environmental geographical questions that I want to answer, but not just for my own curiosity. I want to answer these questions because of the justice that can come from a solid answer. If you know that someone else has poisoned your food, maybe they owe you something. Maybe they owe you some reparations that will allow you to achieve that same level of health in your diet that you no longer can do because of their pollution. So these are the questions that I've begun asking. It's almost a full circle where I started off in a very environmental, very geographical study. I was out there on that boat with the GPS in my hand, circled all the way around through public health, and I'm coming back now to this same area of spatial analysis. Where's this stuff coming from? Where's it going? And how did it get there? So this is where I am next. I hope that if I make it to Tufts again in the next 10 years or so, I might have some answers to these. I might have some arrows on this map. But for now, I have only questions. So thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to take other questions.
Thank you so much. What are your ideas on how to approach this kind of, because you have like you have the entire planet to work with.
Yeah.
How are you going to narrow down where spatially this stuff is coming from?
Great question. There are a couple of ways to do that, and one is alluded to by this image. I think a study of air and ocean currents will help us to narrow down the possible sources. Another, and let me back up, that is with available technology now, right? We've got satellite data, we've got GIS, we can do this with what we have now. The other is a bit more futuristic, and that is to take the mercury itself that we're extracting from these tissues and fingerprint it. And the way we would do that is by using stable isotope analysis, which does not yet work for mercury that has gone all the way up through the food chain. But I was down at the Harvard School of Public Health a couple days ago, and one of the lead mercury researchers there was very encouraging because he was also working on that same thing. And if Harvard can't figure it out, I don't think it can be figured out. But with those two approaches, we don't need that one, right? We could go with the more spatial analysis as well. The problem then, though, is what do you do with that information? What if it's coming from the U.S.? What if every single mercury molecule that we find has that thumbprint of of West Virginia coal? What do? You go to The Hague? I mean, it becomes a question not so much of spatial analysis and more of international law or international justice at that point. This is by far the most interdisciplinary project I've ever been a part of. Yes, ma'am.
Are you concerned that if you work with the Ministries of Health in St. Vincent, you'll have the same reaction as in the Faroe Islands, where people hear this, they're going to increase their consumption of whale? Yeah,
that's a good suggestion. Luckily, I was there in the Faroe Islands. I saw it happen firsthand. I was working with the ministries there as they were getting this reaction where people were saying, forget it, we're going to eat this anyway. And I like to think that I can learn from others' mistakes and that I would approach this in a way that did not invite that kind of reaction. Now, I do attribute most of that reaction to the presence of foreign anti-whaling protesters in the Faroe Islands. And as yet, they have been very scarce in the Caribbean. They haven't been absent, but they've been much less visible than they were in the Faroe Islands. As long as my face is not the face that is associated with this news, as long as it's a local person, a local minister maybe of health, sharing this information with the people, and I'm not the public face of it, which why would I be, I think it would be better accepted. It won't be seen as oppression coming in from abroad. I hope, but that's easy. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I was hoping you could share a little bit more about sort of your experience in this interdisciplinary project in obtaining funding and publishing across disciplines with like widely different theoretical and methodological backgrounds.
Yeah, great, thank you. So the funding question is, I guess in some ways the easiest to answer. I've had to learn to get by with little. There's never been much. I've never had a big NSF grant or anything. Sarah mentioned very nicely several of the fellowships I've been awarded. Many of those didn't come with any money. They were, plaque on the wall. No, you work with local partners. You build capacity there so that they can do a lot of the work. They're equal partners. They're not just assistants or fixers for you. When you do go there, you don't live like a foreign entourage of visitors. You just live like local people and eat the local food. Not the whale anymore. It's got too much mercury in it. But you adjust your standards so that you're not spending as much money. The harder question, though, is the theoretical breadth of this project. I can't do it all myself. So I rely on expert collaborators. I've worked with biochemists, marine biologists, policy analysts, public health professionals. These are all experts in fields that I am very, very much a novice in. I don't bring anything to the table to help with the biochemical analysis. I can sometimes be there on scene to put stuff into the correct size beaker, but I rely on my partnerships there. Part of what gets those partnerships going, I think, is the novelty of this, and the novelty and the chance to actually make a difference. Right? A lot of science feels to the scientists as though it kind of exists within the halls of academia, and to find that outside connection is a bit difficult. We all go through that. With this approach, with this project, the results are tangible, right? Someone's life could be improved. A lot of people, there's 100,000 people in this country, right? That we can improve a lot of lives this way. So I think that has helped to attract partnerships. Some of it might be, oh, come to the Caribbean, but then they get down there and realize this is not the same Caribbean that they thought they were going to. So I trick people that way.
Sorry, I have a question. Going back to your methodology for how you're going to answer these questions, assuming the fingerprinting doesn't work or you don't have it yet, I'm assuming that the fact that the whales can move from place to place and across currents might be a confounding factor.
Yeah, definitely.
How are you going to deal with that?
We need to get satellite tags on whales. We've done that in other parts of the world, and I say we. I've actually been on hand doing that. We haven't done it yet in the Caribbean. It goes back to the question of funding, right? Once we get some funding for some tags for a research vessel to go out and tag the whales, we'll know how far they're traveling.
I also have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
So the first one is related to the levels of mercury, which seem quite alarming. Have you seen any data on mercury poisoning in the population? And my second question is a little bit broader. It's more about some comparisons that you have seen between the relationship between the Faroe Islands and the Caribbean, and in the relationship with whale consumption and the culture. What are some big differences between the two cultures?
Okay, good. Yeah, so the first question about effects of mercury poisoning. Again, this is like the thing with the biochemists. I'm not a physician. I like to tell my kids I'm not that kind of doctor. Not a useful doctor. I've seen people who are certainly suffering from some sort of neurological illness. Now, whether that's a birth defect, well, mercury poisoning can lead to birth defects. Whether that is related to mercury or to some other cause, I can't say. I've never taken human tissue samples for analysis because I'm not qualified to do so. However, that's on the agenda for one of the next steps. This is very much a work in process. A work this is ongoing. If you read the book that I've written, and I hope that the Tufts Library will buy it so you can check it out for free, you're going to come to the end of it, and you're not going to feel a sense of closure. And that's because it's closed. Right? It gets you to the point where things are right now and leaves you hopefully wanting to join a project like this. Right? This is an area where a lot of people can contribute. In terms of differences between the culture, I think the biggest is economic. The Faroe Islands are a wealthy European country. There's no poverty there. And in St. Vincent the Grenadines, there's very much a problem with poverty. People are living a subsistence lifestyle. Of course, there's the wealthy upper class, but there's a very large lower class that's growing their own food, fishing their own fish. When they do splurge on buying food for the market, it's the cheaper food, like the whale meat.
Yep. When you informed, is this on?
It's just for the online guests.
When you informed the Vincentians about the mercury levels, was their reaction similar to that of the Faroese, or were they reluctant to believe that their traditional lifestyle was hurting them so much.
Well, let me correct your premise, because we're at the point right now where the data exists here, but not yet there.
I see.
Now, I have shared it with the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Fisheries, and just because I'm a human and I care about individual people, with some of my really good friends in St. Vincent. But I have not yet had any sort of broad public sharing of the data. That is planned for the future. But one of the frustrating things about science is these things take time, right? There are peer reviews to be conducted. I don't feel comfortable having a public forum to share these data until the data have gone through the process that exists within the scientific culture to have them validated. So we're working on it, and if people are consuming too much mercury in the meantime, that's one of the unintended and unfortunate consequences here. Now, of those small sets that I have shared the information with, I have not had any reaction, and I mean literally zero, of I don't believe it, right? Certainly people don't like the information, but I haven't had anyone reject it out of hand. One of my best friends in St. Vincent told me that he stopped eating whale meat because of this. Now, my data showed low mercury in the blubber. He said, I'm going to keep eating blubber. We haven't yet done the PCB analysis that you were asking about.
Yeah, I was wondering, the 1978 was the data set from Faroe Islands. Has anything been done since then?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that was just the first one. And they've done it almost every year. They established birth cohorts that year, so they've been following kids for their whole lives. The 1977, 1978 was 40 years ago. These children are adults now. And they've established other birth cohorts going on beyond that. They're still taking tissue samples from the whales, and they're finding increasing levels of mercury in the whales. Whether the numbers are increasing or decreasing in the people basically correlates to their adherence to those dietary guidelines. Yeah, so it is very much still a work in process. In the ocean, in the environment worldwide, it is rising, yes. Yes. But not anything to the levels that we're seeing in St. Vincent. There's something special going on, and I mean special in a bad way, going on down there in the Caribbean to concentrate mercury in that environment. And I don't yet know what that is. Yes?
I value your discussion of interdisciplinarity in your work very much, and I'm quite surprised that you haven't mentioned specifically anthropology or ethnography and your role in that. Could you talk a little bit about you as someone who's conducting ethnographic research?
Yeah, thank you. That's my role in this process. So I graduated from a graduate program in geography, but it was a joint geography and anthropology program at LSU. And if you just thumb through this book, you're going to think of it as ethnography, right? In fact, was down on Harvard Square recently and saw it in a bookstore shelved with the anthropology section. So if I am able to contribute, or whatever I am able to contribute to this process or to this project, besides just coordination among colleagues, that's the part that I've done. I've spent, what did Malcolm Gladwell say, 10,000 hours and you become an expert at something? I've certainly spent my 10,000 hours on the ground, sharing meals, having conversations with people about Vincentian culture, about what it feels like to be there. Someone once called me Vincentian by association, which I took as a compliment. Yeah, that's essential. I mean, if you don't know the culture, if you haven't done your ethnographic homework, you will come into this culture as the outsider and have exactly the opposite effect as you want to have. Assuming what you want to have is better healthy lifestyles, better informed dietary choices being made, you've got to know the culture into which you're inserting that information. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I overlooked that one because it was my own contribution. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm not sure, I don't know if this information exists, but I'm just curious about the history of whaling there.
Which?
The history of whaling in St. Vincent.
Yeah.
Just because whaling was such a huge part of the global economy and would have been ubiquitous, and now it exists in just a couple places.
Quick show of hands. Who's from Massachusetts? Okay. Who's from New England, more broadly? Okay. So I am from Florida. Whaling in the Caribbean is your fault, or it's your ancestors' fault. Here's how whaling got started down there. No, it's true. Back in the days of Moby Dick, right? So whale boats were sailing out of Nantucket and out of New Bedford and probably out of Boston itself, right? They were going among other places, to the Caribbean to hunt whales. The captains realized, I don't want to pay these guys, these American guys that demand, you know, $15 an hour, or whatever the equivalent was back then, for the whole voyage when they're not catching any whales. I'm going to go with an empty boat, you know, just the basic crew, just enough people to keep the sails up. When I get to the Caribbean, I'm going to hire locals who will work for a lot less. I'll teach them how to whale, and then I'll make more profit for myself. And that worked. They did it. The consequence, or the outcome of this that was unintended, was when they finished whaling, they dropped these guys off back in their home islands, left to come back up here with all their profits, sailed into Boston Harbor and bought new houses. Down in the Caribbean, they retained these skills. They remembered how to whale. They started local whaling operations, not just in St. Vincent. They used to proliferate around the Caribbean. It's just by attrition that St. Vincent is the only country doing it on a large scale today. But it's because they were taught from New England whalers how to do it. Oh, don't leave it at me blaming New England. I love, I love Massachusetts. Let me just mention, we don't have any copies of the book here, but if you do want to pick up, I've got my contact information. I've got some cards with little QR codes on the back if you want to see the book on the Harvard Press website. And then my editor, Janice, is here. She can talk with you about how to actually get a copy of the book. She probably knows a bit more about where it's available. But it's also available on Amazon, which is easy. So, thank you.